how closely should we expect this to follow the book versus being your own vision?
I couldn't ever hope to make anything that could even like encompass the like greatness of this book. So all I could do was, I don't know, make a movie that made me feel the way the book made me feel. And so therefore it just felt right to say it's Wuthering Heights, and it isn't. You know, it's just so strange.
The book itself is extraordinarily strange, intense, and poetic. And I suppose because of its strangeness, it sort of still feels so modern. It means you can sort of take risks, and not in the sort of way that I think people maybe think it might be, where you're making sort of like provocative filmmaking, but it's more about like risks of taste. There's so much restraint now in design and art and emotion, actually. And so all of us having the permission to go far, to be like a little bit more rococo, to sometimes be garish, I like to push things till they're almost ugly.
If you view this film from the perspective of Emerald Fennell making a version of Wuthering Heights that was programmed towards book talk, or to embody the current online culture that celebrates things like high fashion, the old money aesthetic, female sexual liberation, and bad boys, then it makes perfect sense, whether you agree with her choices or not. Emerald Fennell is not a dumb or uncultured woman with an elementary understanding of classic literature, the way so many video essayists try to make her out to be. She's actually an intelligent, unapologetically creative filmmaker who is passionate about bringing her singular vision to life. Things make a lot more sense when you view her from that light. There's a quote from Fennell that Margot repeated in an interview, and I found it so hilarious, but it epitomizes what I see in her work, and I can 1000% relate to her passion.
I mean, one of the first things Emerald said to me was, when we spoke very early on, I said, what's your dream for the project? She said, I want people to cry so hard they vomit. And I was like...
Now, granted, selling any rendition of Wuthering Heights as the greatest love story ever told is a choice, and in my opinion, it's clearly a good bit of rage-baiting hyperbole for marketing purposes. But I will say I do see the vision, even if the nature of these characters and their doomed relationship precludes it from being, by definition, a great love story. Unlike Pride and Prejudice or Titanic or The Notebook, Fennell is rather controversial, but she has the brains and temerity to back it up and still deliver media that is uniquely thought-provoking and encourages endless conversation. Wuthering Heights is a Victorian Gothic novel written by Emily Bronte and published under the pen name Elias Bell in 1847. The name is indicative of the time when it was frowned upon for women to pursue writing as a profession, so all three Bronte sisters published novels under male pseudonyms. I love their works, especially Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It is one of my favorite novels of all time. Wuthering Heights happened to be the only novel Emily Bronte ever penned, and we are not privy to many of her own thoughts on her own work, since it was published under a pseudonym, so she couldn't give public commentary on it. Sadly, it wasn't as widely celebrated during her life as it is today, with many Victorian critics finding it appalling and its characters morally reprehensible.
At the time when the book came out, it was sort of eviscerated. People couldn't understand it. In all of the reviews, there's this feeling that they know that she's a woman, and they're angry and repulsed that a woman could feel these things.
The novel centers on the love story, although modern readers would argue it's not a love story, but a trauma bond between Cathy Earnshaw and her adoptive brother Heathcliff as they grow up together on a forlorn upland estate in northern England called Wuthering Heights. The novel is known for its ruthless characters and for its unforgiving portrayal of obsession, betrayal, hatred, and revenge. It also touches on themes of addiction, abuse cycles, racism, and class discrimination. Since this is one of the most beloved stories ever penned, there is a lot of gatekeeping from its most avid fans, who have been hypercritical of the many film adaptations through the years. Although I will say the number of video essays on YouTube and TikTok railing against this particular adaptation, some even before the movie ever premiered, is shocking. Of course, some offer intellectual takes and valid criticisms, but I noticed the trend in their criticisms was frustration that the adaptation did not center on themes of generational abuse, racism, imperialism, and other societal factors believed to be influencing the characters at the time. A more modern, post-colonial, therapy-speak reading of the text, if you will. My only question is, who says Fennell had to take that approach? As a director adapting a novel for her own purposes, isn't she allowed to focus on any aspect of the film she pleases? Isn't that how art works? Isn't she allowed to interpret the film to her heart's content? Isn't that a basic tenet of enjoying literature? The death of the author? Honoring the reader's subjective interpretation, though it may not align with the author's original intent? Don't we want art to inspire the creation of new art, to keep people curious, and maybe even encourage them to pick up the 100-year-old novel and read all of its themes at face value if they hadn't before? And to be fair to Fennell, she admits straight up that this is an interpretation of the novel, not a direct or faithful adaptation, because she wouldn't know how to approach trying to capture a novel of this magnitude, because literature is subjective and personal, and this particular work is colossal. She changed fundamental elements of the plot and characterizations, which is kind of the point, yet people are mad at her for doing so. Admittedly, this was supposed to represent her own spin on Wuthering Heights as she remembered it from her earliest reading at age 14, which I find endearing.
I first read the book when I was 14. It just completely cracked me open. It was just the most thrilling experience. It's the most transcendently beautiful book. I've sort of never really stopped thinking about it. And so then looking at turning it into a film, I wanted to reflect that first experience as best as I could. And it is a kind of sensory experience and a physical one. I think that's what Bronte is so incredible at. I first read Wuthering Heights when I was about 14, and it just sort of got me by the throat. It pushed me into a world of adult feeling that I had never really been able to access before. What I wanted to make was a kind of response to it, maybe a sister rather than a twin. Something that distilled the feeling that I had when I first read it.
Some may say this is an excuse for her to dismiss the darker, more controversial aspects of the book in favor of romanticizing an abusive antihero and a trauma bond instead, to which I say that is exactly what you would expect of someone interpreting the novel through the lens of their teenage self. It could even be seen as a satirical, deeply nuanced take on the misinterpretation of literature at a young age, if you think about it, and how the naivety of young girls who lust after bad boys could result in you being debased and abused, like Isabella in the novel, because she romanticized everything, including Romeo and Juliet, or how selfishness and a shallow, materialistic worldview could lead to a life of tedium and misery and fatal levels of regret, like Catherine. Or in Heathcliff, how envy and seeking vengeance are self-destructive moral failings, that in the pursuit of revenge, you typically become no different than the people who wronged you, perhaps even worse, as in Heathcliff's case, because he took his hatred out on innocent bystanders. And sure, he was made more palatable for the purposes of selling the quote-unquote romance, hence the murder of the dog was not included, but he was not totally defamed. I personally don't see Isabella's consent to Heathcliff's debasement as normalization by Fennell. Sure, she teased elements of S&M throughout the work, but she actually cast Isabella's story arc in a pretty negative lens. This fanciful, weird young girl, which a lot of us were when we were younger, was depicted as vulnerable and naive. That is undeniable. And then clearly taken advantage of by someone with demonic machinations. She was portrayed as losing her personhood under Heathcliff's evil influences. She was literally dehumanized by him. And Fennell even gave us a poignant reaction of Nellie witnessing the abuse and trying to remove her from it as the much needed moral guidepost in that hideous environment, like a caring mother or older sister. If Nellie's reaction to the abuse hadn't been present in the story, then yeah, you could totally argue that Fennell was trying to romanticize Heathcliff's abuse, but in my opinion, she clearly wasn't. First of all, I am a huge period film buff. At one point when I was younger, I was devouring every one I could get my hands on, on, and I've probably watched some of the more modern classics like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Jane Eyre, and Far from the Madding Crowd about 100 times each now. I'm very much at home in this gothic Victorian setting, and have also read the novel a couple of times in the past and saw previous adaptations of the film. My biggest takeaway from the novel was the love story. It wasn't any of the other themes that people like to heap on. Therefore, unlike many people from what I've seen online, I was actually pumped for a new Wuthering Heights adaptation, even if it was radically altered from the original story, because I believe strongly in creative license for directors, because they are basically writers in a visual medium trying to weave a story together before our very eyes, and I'm willing to trust their particular vision for a project. So as an English major and minor historian and a writer myself, I personally don't get the intense criticism of Fennell or the pretentious rants for her not remaining faithful to the source material, or even sticking to period appropriate attire, or her not focusing on the heavier, more political themes, which would have made this an altogether different movie and clearly was not the one she was interested in making. She was amplifying the wild, tempestuous, age-old love story in all its bleakness and devastation, and that is perfectly okay. Yes, her choices open her up to criticism, but the main criticism I see is people feigning by saying it doesn't have to be an exact replica of the novel, but then dogging it precisely because it dared to change key elements of the original novel to satisfy her own creative whims. That's logically incoherent. Being gatekeeping snobs about the original novel is getting so old, and is why anti-intellectualism, as some people call it, is sadly taking over, because intellectualism is so pretentious and feels exclusionary. People are tired of the snobbiness in the literary world and are celebrating stories that make them feel something and help them to escape. But that's kind of a YouTube problem. A lot of the video essays on YouTube come off as snobby intellectualism and come off as superior, no matter what the subject is. That's why Book Talk is what it is today. It's a reaction to the snobbiness of the literary world, despite the quality of the writing of some of their most popular books being quite insufficient. They don't care, they just want to be moved. Some people will enjoy this adaptation of Wuthering Heights, and that's generally the audience it was made for, not the intellectuals and the purists. And you can see this actually playing out in the scores of Rotten Tomatoes, which I'll mention later. The chasm between the critic score and the audience score. The audience who will love it are probably fatigued by the politics of our day, and so they are not looking for a lesson in the politics of Victorian England. Or people who are tired of therapy speak online today are not looking for therapized takes on the characters, which scold you and say this story is not meant to be enjoyed or loved because Heathcliff is abusive or there's generational abuse and all of this and that. Instead, these viewers are looking to be wowed. They're looking to be moved, and Fennell is speaking to her people, and that's perfectly okay. And honestly, it would have been a lot more boring if Fennell tried to focus more heavily on anything other than the fated romance between Heathcliff and Cathy. The doomed romance is the most interesting, memorable part of this novel, bar none. The other ancillary themes that help to make it great literature are just that, ancillary to the central love story. Had Fennell focused on those heavier themes, the film wouldn't have been as commercially successful, similar to other period films with theatrical releases that remained true to form. This is a look at period films in a similar vein to Wuthering Heights, and you can see the 2011 adaptation featuring the ever-advocated Heathcliff of color totally bombed. The budget was around $5 to $8 million in US dollars, but only pulled in around $2 million worldwide. I'm sure there were a lot of contributing factors to its failures, like the lower budget and particularly the main cast being relative unknowns, but it performed horribly. And also a problem was the plot wasn't sensationalized. But I'm just wondering why the purists didn't support this adaptation with a Heathcliff of color. There wasn't as much buzz about it, but there is a lot of buzz about this Heathcliff not being a person of color. And you can see that other period films of the 21st century that weren't sensationalized in some way, like Baz Luhrmann's The Great Gatsby, or that were not helmed by a beloved auteur like Greta Gerwig's Little Women, only did modestly well. Whereas many period films, even with famous casts, really only tend to do very modestly well, or they outright bomb, like Bellamy, Promise, The Aftermath, or Tulip Fever, and these are films that were made in America or the UK. So, to make this historical film adaptation appeal to a broader audience, Fennell altered several things to make it play better on the big screen, and also she cast the hottest stars of the day. As I alluded to earlier, one of the most common criticisms of the modern adaptations of Wuthering Heights is the whitewashing of the character Heathcliff, which the majority of film adaptations do, by the way, except the 2011 adaptation. This speaks to a broader problem with Hollywood casting biases, I agree, but it also speaks to a problem with audiences, like I mentioned earlier. Honestly, I don't think the Wuthering Heights movie would have appealed to as wide an audience with a brown or black Heathcliff. That's the sad reality, and we saw that play out somewhat with the 2011 version. And so people who want successful movies tend to program toward what they think would be more appealing to the mainstream. Undeniably, Heathcliff is described by Bronte in the novel as a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect and, quote, a little Lascar, or an American or Spanish castaway. A Lascar is defined as a sailor, army servant, or artilleryman from the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, or the Arab world, employed on European ships, particularly British, from the 16th to mid-20th centuries. So it is irrefutable that Heathcliff was a person of color, maybe even biracial, but ultimately his ethnicity is ambiguous enough that it leaves room for interpretation, which could include anything from a Romani to African or Caribbean heritage, or even someone of ambiguous South Asian descent. I believe this was done by Bronte to contribute to his othering in their world throughout the story, and this also contributed to his inherent Byronic mystery. However, the story was never overtly about race. Nevertheless, it's clear his treatment due to his differences, especially the class discrimination, contributed to his lust for revenge, which consumed him by the end of the novel. Since Fennell was admittedly trying to portray the personal fantasy she's held of Wuthering Heights since she was young, with a particular Heathcliff in mind from a particular cover, it's fair to say that she cast a white man because she was conditioned to view Heathcliff as white from past portrayals, and became enamored with that version of him. I do understand the significance of Bronte possibly intending to show the cruelty of British imperialism around the world, uprooting, colonizing, and subjugating people of color, and how it was manifesting back home with their displacement, like in Liverpool, where Heathcliff was found. To minimize the overt themes of race in the book, to instead promote a more ideal white male is a choice, not one I would have necessarily made, but then again, today there is so much race swapping going on and adaptations going both ways that I just think it becomes a moot point and most audiences won't care. We've had the opportunity to see them visualized by many different directors and illustrators through the years, and we all have our personal favorites. That will always be the case. For me personally, I don't like the casting for other reasons. Margot Robbie looks so annoyingly modern. I think people call it iPhone face, which is amusing. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Don't get me wrong, she is stunning and beautiful. We all know that. I don't know how to explain it, but she has this almost plasticky, idealistic, modern beauty that is unremarkable because so many people do all they can with hair and makeup and plastic surgery to look like her. The bleached blonde hair, the wide blue eyes, the perfectly arched eyebrows. Her looks are so crisp and ideal and well defined that everyone vies for this sort of perfection, and so everyone has started looking the exact same. I can't stand her face for this role. It's too current. It makes suspending disbelief to become immersed in this world nearly impossible. She is really saved by the dramatic costuming here, which is doing a lot of heavy lifting to transform her into Catherine. I kid you not, I said the same thing when she was cast in Tarzan. After watching 2011's Jane Eyre obsessively on repeat, where everyone looked so authentically Victorian, even Michael Fassbender, Margot looked way too high def and millennial in Tarzan, and it annoyed the hell out of me. Plus, she's also way too famous nowadays, and you can't help but see her as Barbie. Someone with softer, more ghostly features like Mia Wasikowska, or someone who can look gorgeously feral like Margaret Qualley, or more ethereal like Mia Goth. Not those specific actresses, but someone similar to them who captures their aesthetic, and even a total unknown would have been so much more believable in this role in my opinion, but it may have suffered at the box office as a result. So it's kind of like you have to program to the outcome you want. The film actually did quite well at the box office. It was released on Valentine's Day 2026 and grossed over $242 million. $84 million was domestic and $156 million was grossed internationally, and that was all against a budget of about $80 million. So it was indeed quite profitable, although it's reported that the marketing budget for the film was quite steep and that they went all out, the cost of which would be in addition to the $80 million production budget, meaning it may not have been as profitable as it seems at first, but I'm pretty sure it was still pretty profitable. Margot Robbie was reportedly paid $12 million for the film, and Jacob Elordi was paid $1 million. The film weathered a lot of preemptive criticism before it ever finished filming, mainly directed at Emerald Fennell being the director because people felt she would debase the original work with her controversial style, and also at the casting of another white male as Heathcliff, as well as the casting of Margot Robbie as Cathy due to her age and iPhone face. The film also faced massive criticism after its release, which I detailed earlier in the video. It's currently sitting at a 58% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes with over 300 reviews and a 76% for the verified audience score, which says a lot. It seems that the audiences like this film much better than the critics, who are more representative of the purists and the Bronte loyalists, I would imagine. Because a lot of what I'm seeing online is that people understand that this was an adaptation. Only the purists and YouTube essayists seem to be pretty upset by this, but most people kind of enjoyed it just for what it was and left it at that. So the critics' consensus on Rotten Tomatoes was liberally adapting Emily Bronte's classic story with a heavy dose of carnality and chic stylization. Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights might not be the stuff of high literature, but it is a visually vibrant pleasure, and that's kind of just it. You kind of just have to leave it at that. And I also noticed that many of the positive critic reviews I read seemed to also grasp, like the audience, that the stark departures in this film from elements of the original work were intentionally done, and that Fennell was trying to capture a particular mood and aesthetic, and in that sense, she undeniably succeeded, especially where the visuals were concerned. The world building was astounding. She did an incredible job. So some people criticized the plot for being quite hollow, which I agree. The film seemed more focused on beauty and style than actually fleshing out the romance they wanted to focus on, and especially in the teen years, not when they were children, but when they were representing teens. But she should have took the time to do this, in my opinion, to justify the intense passion they felt for one another in adulthood. More scenes of them emotionally intertwining when they were younger, the teen versions of themselves, would have been helpful in selling the bond, instead of the one scene we saw of Heathcliff protecting her from abuse as a child, and then the one scene we saw of them sort of becoming sexually awakened together. I think it needed way more than that to sell the intense passion they felt when Cathy died. And it also could have included more obvious pining and eye contact, or even sexual and romantic curiosity in the older years before they became adults. A lot more could have been done to flesh out their relationship and make it more emotional for the audience, and it did fail to that end. So to sum up what I feel Fennell was going for with the story, although it lacked in some areas and was overdone in other areas, is this quote from Coleman Splide, I believe his name is, and he is writing for Salon.com. Its anachronisms are earnest and confident. Its deviations from the source material are digressions done with love. Fennell's Wuthering Heights is a soaring, achingly romantic tribute to the rapturous feeling of reading a great book, tearing through every page in a single afternoon. And by rebuking irony entirely to commit to that vision, Fennell's film brings Bronte's novel to life in a way that few book-to-screen adaptations dare to do, reminding us that our fantastical idea of a book can be just as meaningful as the author's. That completely encapsulated what Fennell was trying to do with this film and what I perceived that she was trying to do with this film. I don't see how other people don't understand that. Again, I wholeheartedly agree with the review by Coleman Splide for Salon.com, which continues, but much like Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, she, Fennell, is not trying to retell this famous tale. She's reimagining it as the outsized, grand spectacle it has become in both public consciousness and personal affection. Her Wuthering Heights is a great film because it doesn't try to be anything more than a feeling, transmitted with the utmost sincerity and beauty. It's that same feeling that's so deep deeply impactful for the viewer, the one that will make them want to go straight from the movie theater to the bookstore. That is perfectly articulated. She is trying to transmit a feeling she had when reading the novel at 14, even if it wasn't the most accurate depiction of the novel itself. That is exactly what she's trying to do, and that is exactly what she did. Its shortcomings are justified by the lens through which she interpreted the novel as an immature teen. This film was essentially Emerald Fennell casting, rather transparently, some of her favorite actors to be staged as dolls in her life-size playhouse, which would be the beautiful, maximalist, anachronistic set design and costumes in her version of Wuthering Heights. This was a 14-year-old girl's fan fiction version of Wuthering Heights, and in that respect, I kinda dig it. I totally understand the director's vision and sympathize with some of her choices, especially with regard to her focusing on the romance in the sweeping historical setting rather than the broader themes of the original novel. Much like she did with Saltburn, by the way. Everyone thought it would be this highly politicized, etherish satire, shining a light on class discrimination and the evils of white privilege, I guess, when in truth, Saltburn was an unapologetic riot. Sure, it was extremely derivative and camp and unserious, but it was just Emerald Fennell being as unhinged as she wanted, and I absolutely respect that as a fellow writer. And I just respect her fearless takes on things that she finds interesting and how creative and unrepentant she is when it comes to serving her vision over the public's rigid expectations. She knows she's gonna find her audience, and that's all she cares about. As much as I didn't like Margot for this role, her performance was still quite moving. She can cry compellingly and did a great job of articulating her heartache with her eyes, since so much of her body was confined by the restrictive quasi-Victorian attire. In my opinion, Margot's ardency carried all the chemistry between her and Elordi, and easily overshadowed him. He seemed like he was only there to react to her, which, to be fair, was kind of Heathcliff's entire point of existing. It was a reaction to Cathy, basically. He lived for loving her or hating her. Everything he did was driven by his deep affection for her or seeking revenge for her betrayal, up to and including the woman he eventually married. But in this adaptation, I don't think Elordi contained enough fire to be Heathcliff. I just kept seeing him as the monster from Frankenstein, and it was so distracting and off-putting. Elordi, he was just Frankenstein in my eyes. The big, lumbering, oafish behavior, the quiet brooding. It's almost like he's hiding a lot behind his imposing size and not giving as much variety in his performance. He did do a really good, compelling job as playing Nate Jacobs in Euphoria and as playing Elvis and Priscilla, and he did a great job as Frankenstein too, the monster in Frankenstein. But for some reason, he just was really dialed down for this Heathcliff, and I didn't like it. Whereas when Ralph Fiennes played Heathcliff, there's this slightly demented, almost possessed look behind his eyes. This intrinsic fire that I feel fits the character so freaking well, and they should have carried on in that vein and found somebody else with that sort of intensity behind their eyes. You can see any still of Ralph Fiennes from the 1992 adaptation and feel the spirit of Heathcliff leaping from the screen. It doesn't take much. Jacob is too dialed down and relies too much on his height and his hair to sell his characters. I have no idea how to explain what I mean by that, other than to say he is far too complacent in the knowledge that he's a heartthrob, just because he towers over everyone and he knows girls will swoon over everything he does, no matter what. And this is an interesting bit of discourse I saw in a YouTube video where they discuss why actors are no longer unattractive. Because if you look in the past, especially a lot of male actors were pretty average looking and unattractive. They had receding hairlines, they were overweight, but they could act their asses off. Someone like Paul Giamatti or Gene Hackman or like Philip Seymour Hoffman. Those actors are not traditionally attractive, or they're not super attractive like models, so they never become complacent in their good looks. They actually have to serve in every scene to compel the audience, and they are some of the greatest actors we have ever known. Brandon Sklenar, he is so obsessed with appearing sexy, he gives us nothing as an actor, absolutely nothing. And so I think I'm really tired of people casting super attractive actors who just become complacent in the knowledge that they are attractive and heartthrobs. It's really sickening. But I will say Jacob Elordi can act. It's just that he didn't do a good job as Heathcliff. And you can tell he was self-aware about being a hottie, and he knows that's the very reason this particular director cast him, because Fennell is obviously obsessed with him, and she made that clear during Saltburn. It was just like an homage to his beauty. He personifies some sort of strange teenage fantasy for her, and she even mentions as much when she says that that weird mop of hair he had during Saltburn with his sideburns reminded her of the Heathcliff that she remembered from an old cover of Wuthering Heights, and you see where this all is going.
So Jacob was playing Felix in Saltburn, and obviously in the mid-noughties, the sideburn was quite a big moment. And when I first saw him in the haircut, I realised he looked exactly like the Heathcliff on my sort of very, very well-worn copy of Wuthering Heights that I'd had since I was a teenager.
As a writer and a reader who had an unhealthy obsession with the cover art of novels my whole life, especially historical romances from the 70s and 80s, I totally get what she means by that. Falling in love with him because he looked like one of the guys on the cover of one of these novels, because those novel covers were really impactful for me, especially like entering the world of the story and just being amazed and in awe and falling in love with the characters. And I get that she would be excited to find someone who fits the version of this story she's had playing in her head for so many years. This is where Jacob did excel. He does cut a menacing figure when you see his long, strong silhouette in the background of some shots, especially when he's walking across the misty moors. He perfectly embodies Heathcliff in that regard. And he has that Mr. Darcy, played by Matthew McFadyen-esque look when he's towering over Cathy in different scenes, especially in the rain. Emerald Fennell made this movie for the girls, and for a very particular type of girl, which I definitely identify with. Still, based on the source material, Elordi as Heathcliff never feels genuinely infernal, or like he's capable of truly diabolical things. Even the director referred to the two characters as emotional terrorists, and Margot certainly delivers here, especially when she's older and being so ruthless to everyone around her, but Elordi feels like Heathcliff was defamed. Too tender-eyed, too soft-spoken, and even during the scenes when he's being an abusive asshole to Isabella, all I can see is Jacob Elordi being timid with his legs crossed and being meek in interviews, so it didn't really translate. He never felt truly dangerous or evil, and I suppose that's because the second half of the story, after Cathy's death, was excised, so he didn't really need to go to those extremes. It ended when Cathy died, so we didn't get the deranged grave digging scene, which is so quintessentially Heathcliff. That's like the first thing you think of when you think of Wuthering Heights, that Heathcliff was so obsessively in love with Cathy that he went insane after her death and was haunted by her and had her corpse dug up years later when it was all decomposed, and somehow you could relate to this on some deranged level in a remote part of your heart if you've ever been madly in love. That sense that you will not let death part you from the person you love, and despite them being a rotted corpse, you are so spiritually intertwined, you see them no differently than when they were at their most beautiful. Hosier's lyric always evokes this story for me when he says, "No grave can hold my body down, I'll crawl back to her." It's demented, but it's also wildly romantic and quintessentially gothic. That's Wuthering Heights, and that's why we love it. It dared to suggest that love and romance could be this hideous, which is fascinating. Also, I think the production design and cinematography and Cathy's wardrobe were all magnificent. I have zero complaints. They were imaginative and gorgeous and fun to look at. It transported me to a world of grandiose fantasy beyond the moral manners that we've come to expect of the story. I've seen many people compare the visuals to the almost unnerving otherworldliness of Poor Things, and I totally agree. That movie kind of unnerved something in me with its visuals, but that's why it was so fascinating. It totally transported you to a world you couldn't even quite define. Scene after scene, you were quite literally stunned by the optics, which often looked as though they were pulled straight out of old world paintings of the European aristocracy.